Christopher Walter Monckton, 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, is a former prime ministerial advisor on scientific and domestic policy to Margaret Thatcher. In 1986, he advised her that global warming might be a problem and recommended that it be investigated. 2 years later, Ms. Thatcher established the Hadley Centre for Prediction and Research. In 2007, Lord Monckton wrote a report concluding that global warming would not be a global crisis. It was published in the Sunday Telegraph, where it was the most read article ever. Lord Monckton is a world-renowned climate change expert, having twice testified before the U.S. Congress. He has addressed a Tea Party rally in Houston, a high-level briefing at Lloyd's of London, and the European, German, and Danish parliaments. He also attended the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. He has been with us before. Let's welcome back to the Global Freedom Report Lord Christopher, the 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley. Lord Monckton, thanks for being with us.
Well, Brent, after that wonderful introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. A couple of things, though, since you last put that together. I've now testified 4 times before Congress. I've also been to the United Nations conferences in Cancun and Durban, and most recently at Rio as well.
Well, I will have to update my information before the next time, for certain. Last month, Prince Charles came out with a public statement effectively saying that unless the world takes collective action, there will be a global catastrophic consequence due to global warming. Did something in particular happen to prod the prince into making such a statement at this time?
I think he's long been very silly on this issue. I have tried, as many others have, to reason with him on it and say, look, do not be fooled by the clutch of left-wing advisors who surround you on this issue. You must listen to both sides, and really, while you are the next in line to the throne, you mustn't get into politics, because politics are not science, and you must stand back from it. But he refuses to stand back from it, and is making himself, I'm afraid, look sillier and sillier the more he predicts doom, and the more obvious it is that doom isn't happening. After all, we've now had no global warming, I mean none at all, for 15 years. And that doesn't mean there'll never be any global warming, doesn't mean that CO2 has no effect. Yes, it does. I would expect the planet to warm, but so gently that it will be harmless and, on the whole, beneficial. So the idea that the prince has been trying to peddle, that we have to shut down the economies of the West, close down the royal family, go back to a sort of universal communism where everybody is dirt poor, and this will somehow save the planet from supposed climate catastrophe, this is now wildly, extremely out of date.
Yes, and he spoke about watching with despair at the slow pace of progress on these issues. He cited scientific evidence as showing the potential consequences of, quote, ignoring the risks. What scientific evidence was he citing, and exactly what risks was he referring? Do you have any idea?
Right. Yes, of course. He's referring to the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is run by the corrupt, self-serving UN. And for most people, that would be enough. You don't need to know anything more about it. However, let us just look at what they're saying. They're saying, quite rightly, that if you add carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, you will get warmer weather. And you'll get approximately 1 Celsius degree of warming for every doubling of carbon dioxide concentration. Now, what the UN goes on to say is where the science really falls apart. The UN goes on to say that if you trigger that amount of warming, then twice as much again will occur. So you triple the original amount of warming caused by the CO2, because the atmosphere will behave in various ways. There will be more water vapor, which is also a greenhouse gas, the most important of them, in fact, because of its sheer quantity, that they say will amplify the original warming. So instead of getting 1 Celsius degree or 2 Fahrenheit degrees of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration, you will instead, says the UN, get 3 Celsius degrees. But that is frankly speculation. And it's astonishing how they've managed to get away with saying there is some sort of a scientific consensus on the magnitude and direction of these feedbacks, when we don't even know their sign. We don't even know whether they will amplify or in fact slightly reduce the temperature that is caused, the warming that's caused by CO2. And it's this amplification which is where the real division is between the likes of Prince Charles, who are true believers in the scare story, and the likes of me, who have looked at the science and have realized that as things stand at the moment, we do not have good evidence that there's going to be this huge amplification. And indeed, there is a growing amount of evidence in the literature now. A paper literally came out just 2 days ago, which says that notwithstanding the warming we've seen over the last 50 years, there has been really no increase in water vapor in the atmosphere in that time. And that was the biggest cause of the amplification imagined by the UN. So frankly, the Prince is out of date with his science now. It is no longer possible to say, as they tried to say originally, that we know or have very strong reason to suspect that we'll get this big amplification of the original very small warming caused by CO2. So the Prince is out of line, he is scientifically inaccurate, and he is straying more into politics than into science.
It seems as if the term global warming has become passé. I mean, there has been growing evidence that it's a non-existent threat. Now we're hearing much more frequently the phrase climate change. Are the two terms supposed to mean the same thing, just packaged differently, or is climate change more accurate a description of whatever changes are happening to the Earth?
The fact is that climate has been changing. You're too young to remember this, but it's been changing for 4,567 million years. And so the idea of climate change is not new. That's what climates do. The very word climate comes from a Greek meaning a sudden change. That's what climate does. It changes. So the idea that the left are trying to push around that people like me are deniers of climate change is, of course, fatuous, because one would be denying the well-known history of the enormous lapses we have seen for purely natural reasons in the climate ever since the first wisps of atmosphere formed 4.5 billion years ago. But they started out by calling it global warming, and then the global warming stopped, and that was very inconvenient for them. Then they tried calling it climate change, and the likes of me said, yeah, but the climate's been changing for 4.5 billion years, so that's not new. So then they tried calling it climate disruption, suggesting that somehow the extreme weather events we've seen, for instance, heat waves in the US and droughts we've seen, floods in the United Kingdom, somehow this is all because of global warming. Well, no, it isn't. All of these extreme events have happened in these places far worse before than they're happening now, and so there's nothing new in that either. So they lost out on climate disruption. Then they tried calling it energy security. Problem with that was that shale gas was then discovered in vast quantities, so that the US within the next 5 years will be entirely self-sufficient in fossil fuels. It will no longer have to depend on the Middle East. That will change the entire balance of world politics. So they can no longer call it energy security, and so they're eventually going to fall back on calling it what it actually is, which is absolute rubbish.
Recently, well said. Recently, a small group decided to embark on a project to shield the Earth from the sun's rays in order to protect it from the perceived effects of global warming. Are you familiar with this project?
Well, I mean, there have been numerous projects suggested. It's called geoengineering, and there are various ways of doing it. You can seed the clouds with water droplets that reflect the sunlight back. You can put huge umbrellas up made of very thin layers of aluminium up into space. And all sorts of fancy things have been thought of. Of course, the cost of these things would be staggering, and the difference they would make would be negligible. We have had, and one must go on repeating this, no global warming for 15 years. And if you take, as one should, the rate over the last 60 years as the best guide to remove sort of the natural influences up and down of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which can mess up the calculations if you don't do it over 60-year periods. In the last 60 years, the rate of warming has been the equivalent of just over 1 Celsius degree, or more or less exactly 2 Fahrenheit degrees per century. This is not a problem. So there's absolutely no need for any of this wildly expensive science fiction stuff about shielding the Earth from the sun. We don't need to do that. It's all nonsense.
Well, but then let me just follow through on that a little bit, because it's my understanding that there's a group now that's trying to find some high-tech way to shield us from the sun's rays, and it could be one of the ways you've mentioned. It could be something new, but hypothetically, would such a project, let's assume some kind of high-tech scientific way that we can shield ourselves from the sun's rays, some kind of a sun shield, wouldn't such a project have the potential for dire, unanticipated effects? I mean, the sun gives us light, it gives us
how
heat,
right you are.
It gives us life.
How right you are. These things tend to be not as controllable as we think. And the most dreadful consequences could ensue, the first of which, of course, that the cost of this will be prodigious. It'll come out of general taxation, if it happens at all. I'm rather hoping that the world's leaders are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is all nonsense. Significantly, even President Obama, who has shown himself to be a true believer in this garbage, didn't go to the Rio conference. David Cameron, another sappy true believer in the whole storyline, he didn't go. They're beginning to realize this whole thing smells. And it's they and others like them around the world who are going to have to provide the taxpayer cash to do this nonsense. And frankly, they've now begun to realize that this simply doesn't add up. So this geoengineering, these wild proposals to spend trillions on putting parasols up between us and the sun and interfering with the composition of the atmosphere in various ways, all of these are doomed to failure. They wouldn't make that much difference anyway. And we do not need them. And in fact, it's arguable that even if it were to get 2, 3, 4, even 5 Celsius degrees warmer, right at the extreme high end of the UN's predictions, and we know those predictions now have been overstated, because we've seen what their predictions were since 1990 of how the climate has evolved in our own time, and it simply is, the warming is happening at about 1/3 of the rate that they had predicted. That means we don't need to do anything yet, nor is there any hurry. The idea of the Prince saying, we've got to do something now or it'll be too late. There's no evidence for this unless we see a very, very rapid increase in the warming rate that we've seen over the last 60 years. There's absolutely no hurry at all. We can wait and see. That is the cheapest and most responsible option. And the idea of all this space age, science fiction, geoengineering, this is just yet another way for scientists to try and milk this story for all it's worth to get cash for grants and various kinds of bogus research. And frankly, I think the time has come to say to the scientific community, you had your ride, get off the train, we're not paying your fare anymore.
What about the claims that are being made that the Arctic ice is melting and by next summer it's all going to be melted or some such thing?
Well, it's actually by this summer that it is all due to have melted away. And I think it is fair to the extremists to say that, on my estimation, it's quite likely that we will see less sea ice in the Arctic at the summer minimum around September the 15th this year than we have seen in the last 30 years since the satellites were able to watch. there's no doubt it is declining. But in the Antarctic, until very recently, it's been increasing at more or less the same rate as the Arctic ice has been declining, so that overall sea ice extent has remained much the same. And of course, sea ice extent doesn't matter anyway, because even if all of it melted, the sea level wouldn't rise by so much as a 50th of an inch. It makes no difference if the ice is floating. If it melts, it's not going to increase sea level. The worry is about the land-based ice. But if you take the history of Greenland's ice, for instance, that actually grew in thickness by 2 feet between 1993 and 2004. For 12 years, it grew by 2 feet in that time. And then it declined by about 6 inches between 2005 and now. So the net gain in ice thickness in Greenland of 18 inches, much the same in most of Antarctica. There's a small patch of Antarctica which is called the Antarctic Peninsula, which has a climate quite different from the rest of Antarctica. That has shown some disintegration of land-based ice sheets, but the amount of ice there is simply too small to make any difference. So all of this has been vastly overblown. And no, I don't expect to see the Arctic ice disappearing altogether in the summer. Even if it did, it could only be for a few weeks, because then the sun goes round the other side of the Earth, the Arctic goes back into its winter night, and all the ice very quickly reforms again. So this has wildly been exaggerated as a danger or a scare. It will be beneficial to just about all the creatures in the Arctic if the weather up there does get a little warmer, and if there is less ice there, that'll be a good thing and not a bad one.
And by the way, if you want to do your own test, folks, get a glass of water, fill it 3/4 of the way up, put a bunch of ice cubes in it, check the water level, draw a little line on the outside, and then wait till the ice melts, and then check the water level again, and you'll have your proof. Joe is calling in from Arkansas. Joe, welcome to the show. You're on the air.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question I'd like to ask Bud Monckton. That's this. In the 1980s, I was very interested in the work of a scientist from Missouri named John Hamaker, who was concerned about the increasing carbon dioxide in the air. He thought it would be a problem. But he proposed a solution, which I thought was the best solution I've ever heard, that anyone's ever proposed to this alleged problem. Now, I'm not personally convinced anymore at all that the little bit of carbon dioxide that humans are putting into the air is anything of a significant problem, really. But John Hamaker's solution was that we should grind up a lot of rock dust and distribute this to all the soil all over the world. And this would remineralize the soil and make the soil more fertile, make the plants healthier, make all the food more nutritious, and help the world grow lusher and more fertile and more abundant. And this would take the extra carbon dioxide out of the air, to increase the biomass. And so if there really is a problem of too much carbon dioxide in the air, this seems like the best solution anybody's ever come up with, one that would really help us. But none of these people that claim they're so concerned about too much carbon dioxide in the air ever mention this solution. They don't seem to care about doing something that would really help us.
Well, that's very interesting. First of all, we have tried this rock dust experiment on our garden in Scotland, and it has had the most dramatic effect. The plants with the extra minerals in the soil grow very much faster, very much bigger than they would otherwise. And of course, the other thing that fertilizes them is CO2 itself. You put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the plants will grow much faster, they will need less water to do it, and that's quite important. And in fact, some staple crops would increase their yield by 40% if we doubled the carbon dioxide compared with today. And tests have been done right up to 6,000 parts per million. And plants just love the stuff. They can't get enough of it. It's plant food. So he's talking quite a bit of sense. Of course, it wouldn't take out all the carbon dioxide we are adding. We are liberating quite large amounts at the moment. I say large. Even if we work really hard on it, we will only increase the concentration from 0.04% of the atmosphere to 0.08 over the next 150 years if we try hard. And that, frankly, isn't enough to be a problem. So there isn't anything that really needs solving here. There is no one solution. Even if you regard it as a problem, you'd have to do a lot of little things, monumical macromuckle, as they say in Scotland. But that's not a bad idea. I mean, another idea that Stephen Chu, the energy secretary, came up with, is painting the world white so as to reflect sunlight back into space. It seems he hadn't done his costings. The amount of paint you'd have to use every 3 years to keep it white would, of course, be wildly, wildly, wildly excessive. The cost would be enormous. So the trouble with all of these solutions is that they don't really make very much difference, but they do cost an enormous amount of money. And economically speaking, and this is really the view of most economists who have looked at this, and of course I'm not saying we should do science by head count, but it's worth recounting that the economic literature is full of papers on this. They all say, really, that it's better to do absolutely nothing now. Spend not a single red cent now. Just leave it. Let's see what happens. And then only if we really have a dire problem does it become worth trying to do anything at all. At the moment,
and I have to stop you there. I have to stop you there.
Scientific or economic case.
Lord Monckton, I have to stop you there because we are up against the clock. Thanks for the call, Joe. Thank you so much. The Lord Viscount Christopher Monckton, www.scienceandpublicpolicy.org. That's AND. And whatsupwiththat.com. That's WATTS.